Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman. As always, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. We're going to be starting our very next unit now, the Great Divide. And this is really the kind of officially the intro unit before the Civil War, which we'll be getting to in Unit 6. And so all that sectionalism and all those kind of problems and slavery and industry and all that stuff I talked about in the next unit is really going to come to bear, especially more so in this unit. And as we see, the divide between North and South is going to get even further apart, if you can believe it or not. And so much of that divide actually goes back to even before some of that stuff was going on, but going definitely into it. And it's going to deal with this concept of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny, this push westward, as you could expect, as we're moving farther west and as we're getting new territories and new states, and they're forming their own governments, the whole question of whether or not that is going to be a free or a slave state or territory are going to really highlight and make that issue of slavery all the larger. And also, we're going to start to see in this unit kind of the origin, so to speak, of some of the important leaders that we're going to be talking about during the Civil War, such as Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant. So a lot of people that are going to have a big role in the war to come are going to kind of get their origins of this time period. So again, Great Divide, roughly from 1820 to 1860, starting off with this concept of manifest destiny, a concept that is very much still with us, whether we recognize it or not. And really, the manifest destiny is rooted in this general concept of settling new lands, right? That in around 1800, only around 387,000 white settlers lived west of the Appalachian Mountains, right? So we had picked up all that territory in the Ohio River Valley, remember, right after the Revolution. But not all that many had moved out past the Appalachian Mountains. That was still kind of seen as this official line or demarcation point where a lot of people stopped there and didn't go further past that. Now, 387,000 might sound like a lot. If we're talking about the larger population of the United States, it's not as many as some had hoped. But within 20 years, 25 years, 1827, more than 2.4 million people lived past west of the Appalachian Mountains, and that number was rapidly growing. And some of that was that 387,000 who lived out that far, who were creating their own communities and families, but also there's going to be a push of wave of immigrants, but also even of just in general other settlers who wanted to push that far out. By the time of the Civil War, and this is an important distinction, more people lived west of the Appalachian Mountains than on the Atlantic coast, right? So more people are moving further and further west, and that's going to represent a large demographic shift where more Americans are living west of those Appalachian Mountains than on the East Coast. What are the reasons? Well, as you could expect, economic, right? That some weren't finding their economic opportunities they would hope or expect on the East Coast and on the Atlantic coast. And so they thought, well, if I can kind of move further west, I can create my own future. I can be my own farmer. I don't have to worry about these kind of Eastern elites ruining my day. Also, the religious freedom, which we talked about with some groups like the Mormons and some other denominations that are maybe not finding what they had hoped in the East. They're thinking we'll move west and kind of be able to practice our own religion. Okay. Now, most now use the Mississippi River as a boundary. So it used to be if you went west Appalachian Mountains, that was a big deal. Now it would be west of the Mississippi. So a lot are kind of moving a little further west, but not still going too far. Okay. But more than 250,000 are going to travel 250,000 are going to travel west to the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, California, and Pacific Northwest. So some are going all the way over, but some are just going to kind of go part of the way. Okay. And all this, again, comes back to this concept of manifest destiny, which in many ways is still with us in the kind of a foreign policy sense. It's evolved over the years. But in general, this idea of manifest destiny, kind of in the middle of the 18th or 19th century, was this belief that God had ordained all these Western lands to white American settlers, right? That God himself had blessed us to get all these lands, no matter who's there already, whether that be Native Americans, whether that be other settlers, Spanish, Mexican settlers. We thought, no, God had given us all this land, and so we believe it's our right or our privilege to go and take it. Okay, so that's encouraging in some ways because it gets people to venture out further and kind of, stretch their legs, so to speak. But it also, in some ways, it involves us taking land from people that was rightfully theirs. Okay. And we'll get into that a little later, some instances of that. But the biggest thing is they saw this as justified and inevitable, that it was inevitable for us to eventually reach the West Coast and kind of take control over all that stretch of land. We see that as inevitable now, right? Because that's naturally what the United States map looks like. But at the time, that was not necessarily inevitable. People thought, well, we can go beyond the 13 original colonies and states. But there was a big question of how far America could really go or how far America could expand. So we think of it now as inevitable that, of course, we were going to get California and, the western states, Washington, Oregon, all that. But at the time, that wasn't exactly inevitable, right? That we were going to have to work to get all that land. So again, lots of people were deciding, hey, let's move west because the East Coast just isn't cutting it for us and we find it more restrictive. And some people just wanted to live out their fantasies as kind of, all sorts of manner of success. Okay. So farming was naturally going to be one of the biggest things that people who moved west are going to practice. And squatters are going to be the term for people who settle in lands they technically don't own. Okay. So the federal government had picked up all that land naturally from Louisiana Purchase and various other deals. And so the federal government's going to intend to survey all that land and sell large parcels to real estate companies. But the squatters are kind of going to that land and not waiting to buy it. They're just kind of sitting on it and wanting to buy it, but do it directly from the federal government. So this is actually going to lead to an act known as the Preemption Act of 1830, which was basically this renewable law made permanent in 1841 that protected squatters by guaranteeing them the right to claim land before it was surveyed. So this is a way to kind of keep up with all these people moving west and try to say, okay, you know what? You can actually buy some of that land for yourself as a way to try to cool the situation down. And as an individual, you had the right to buy up to 160 acres of land at the government minimum price of $1.25 an acre. Okay, so if you had a little bit of money, maybe not a whole lot, but a little bit of money, you could actually buy a good amount of land, and it was relatively cheap. Okay, and so Jethro Wood is going to come up with a very important kind of agricultural invention known as the iron-bladed plow. Okay, and then John Deere is going to step it up in 1837 when he engineers a plow with sharp-edged steel blades that cut clearly through the sod, right? So this is going to go a long way in terms of actually making this land more farmer-friendly, that with these steel-bladed plows, you can actually cut through some of that tough dirt and that tough surface and get down there and, actually really have successful farms. Because in the past, farmers really only had wooden plows, which were okay, but didn't really get too deep into the soil. Meanwhile, though, these steel plows come along, and it's going to make farming much, much easier. So with the invention of steel plows, farmers are able to kind of go out and have a lot more success than they had in the past with simple wooden plows. Okay, so farming, again, is going to play a massive role in this westward expansion. As I said, Cyrus McCormick in 1834 is going to create the mechanical reaper, which helps pulls mules and horses, which are going to allow farmers to harvest more grain with far less effort than using a sickle or a scythe. Okay, so mechanical reaper helps pull horses and mules, which makes naturally farming easier for farmers, right? So latecomers to the West realize, the Midwest is already filming up. You have all these farmers with their mechanical reapers and their steel plows. They're already filling up the Midwest. And so they're going to say, well, I guess we're just going to have to go to the Pacific coast. And in general, this is going to change over time. But immigrants are going to assume that there weren't a lot of trees on the Great Plains. That's why they were kind of just considered Great Plains, or what a lot of trees around. And so a lot of people, naturally, immigrants are going to assume this is not great land for farming. Okay. Also, I think something that plays a role in this, in the 1830s, a lot of American missionaries are going to start traveling to Oregon to try to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So missions and missionaries are going to play a role in this westward expansion as well. And so that's why some are going to go out to try to convert Native Americans to Christianity. But this isn't just purely benevolent, right? It's the idea that, if they kind of worship our same God or our same religion, that's going to make it easier for us to kind of have favorable dealings with them, which is going to help us financially. Okay. Now, you might be wondering, hey, who are actually making these maps? How are people really understanding and knowing what direction they're going? Well, much of that terrain that's going to be on the edge of the frontier is going to be difficult, and uncharted territory for many. So there are going to be a small number of trailblazing mountain men. Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, the biggest ones, who are going to make their money fur trapping, who are going to kind of lead the way and kind of make maps along their journey that are then going to be passed down to others to kind of study. So this is pretty dangerous work, right? Because you're kind of just living off the land, and you don't necessarily have a lot of support. Some of these guys are doing it on their own. Some of them are doing it in small parties, but nonetheless, it's going to be very difficult work. But the hard work of these men is going to pay off when it comes to, in the future generations, people traveling west, that they have those maps. Because again, it ain't Google Maps back then, right? It's something on a piece of paper. And even as accurate as that piece of paper is, you could easily lose it in a river, or it accidentally get burned in a fire. I mean, there's a million ways of, a map could go up in smoke, quite literally. So these men, their work is going to be very important in terms of mapping out this area and really being kind of trailblazers when it comes to setting these understandings of where these places are. As you can imagine, again, this is going to be hard living of these people going west. And in the 1840s, mountain men, as I said, are going to start carving out several east to west trails. The Oregon Trail, which you'll be doing a little mini assignment about this where you play the Oregon Trail, right about it, the video game, is going to be the most popular. But also there's going to be a California Trail and a Santa Fe Trail that are kind of going to be places that people generally realize, okay, if you kind of take this general route, you'll get to this place or that place. And so that is naturally going to help out a lot of these settlers. But again, it's a lot of these mountain men that are ones that are carving out these trails for people to take. Now, typically, people are traveling in groups of covered wagons, also known as wagon trains, and they're going to be assembled in these kind of staging areas outside frontier towns, and they're going to try to say, all right, before you leave, this is the route you want to take. Buy your supplies here. Make sure your oxen are trained and well-fed. Practice steering the wagons. In some instances, that's going to be the first time people really have experience with wagons, is training before they directly go out, because new drivers are apt to kind of make it go sideways. There's also going to be a group of guys known as overlanders, who are going to be mountain men hired to lead some of these wagon trains and find their way with the help of guidebooks. So, and you're going to maybe have some families or little communities that are traveling together. They hire some of these overlanders, mountain men who had experience traveling with in these areas, and they're going to kind of lead the way to where they need to go. Okay. Very horrifically, in 1847, there's going to be an instance known as the Donner Party, which was about 87 overlanders together. They're going to find them, going to kind of get off the path. They're going to find themselves stuck in the Sierra Nevada in the midst of a snowstorm, a blizzard, basically. And 41 are going to die due to starvation. And it's even reported that some of the survivors are going to resort to cannibalism to stay alive. Okay, so it goes without saying that hard living, this is no joke, right? That these territories are extremely hard to work in and live in, and some are going to eventually die, and then others are going to actually resort to cannibalism because of how hard this life is. Now, this didn't happen a lot of times, okay? The Donner Party is very famous for being an exception, but it is still something that's dangerous and something that many people had to look out for and worry about. Okay, this here actually shows you the Oregon Trail. Led from Independence, Missouri, went through Kansas, a lot of Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, and stops in northwest Oregon. So the Oregon Trail, the most famous, but there's also going to be a California Trail and a Santa Fe Trail. Go to Santa Fe, New Mexico. So as I said, hard living in these environments, right? Typical trip west took anywhere between 5 to 6 months, and your average wagon train maybe traveled 15 miles a day, which we could easily blow that out of the water now in a car. If you're going on a trip, like you could do that in 15 minutes or something, right? So men are the ones typically driving the wagons. They're the ones hunting game, feeding and carrying the animals at night. Women, they're going to look after the children, cook meals, clean the camp, launder the clothes. Kind of your traditional gender roles apply there. Now, Native Americans, as it turns out, this might be a little bit of a surprise, actual conflict with Native Americans during this particular period of history is actually relatively rare. Okay, so despite what you've maybe seen in Westerns, now later eras are going to be a little more conflict. But at this particular moment, it's going to be relatively rare with conflict between Native Americans and Western settlers. In many ways, oftentimes Native Americans actually give the travelers food and tell them kind of hints on which route to take and where they should go. They kind of help them out, showing, hey, these are the plants you should eat and the water you should drink. And also, they traded horses for cotton, clothing, and ammunition. So, as it turns out, for the most part, the settlers and the Native Americans mostly got along, in part because these settlers are kind of moving over their lands. They're not always just staying on them. So, they're kind of in transit, right? Now, there's going to be a lot of buffalo that are going to start to die off, though, in these Western territories during this time, is why immigration increases. And that's going to worry Native Americans because as we're killing a lot of buffalo ourselves for hides and for food, that's going to start to worry some Native Americans because they're like, well, we rely on the buffalo for hides and for food. So that is going to be one thing Native Americans start to worry about. There is going to be a Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 and 1868, where the U.S. is going to promise Native American groups specific territories in the Great Plains, as well as trying to pay them regular payments, basically on some of these reservations, as long as the settlers are promised a safe passage. So the U.S. government understood that we need to make sure things are good generally between us and these tribes so our citizens can kind of be safe settlers going west, okay? So at this particular moment, not a whole lot of conflict with Native Americans, but that's going to kind of be a future problem. But there are going to start to be some conflicts as Americans, not with Americans and Native Americans, but actually as Americans go to the West Coast and in some Mexican territories that are going to put them in conflict with Spanish settlers and Mexican settlers as well. Because Americans have been moving to California actually before Mexico's independence, which I'm not going to spend, unfortunately, a lot of time on because of the time crunch. Normally I would, but Mexico's going to declare its independence in 1821 from Spain, and it has its own little revolution where they kick Spain out, okay? And so we've been traveling there even when Spain controlled it, okay? And trade with California is going to rise dramatically after Spain's gone, right? So once Spain is gone and Mexico is kind of controlling a lot of the kind of northern territories, which includes parts of California, we're going to start trading even more. And U.S. and Russian traders are going to even use California ports, and because Russia is obviously in the East Asia, they're trading across the Pacific Ocean. And in 1839, the governor of California, Juan Bautista Alvarado, who's going to be kind of governor of California for Mexico, okay, he's actually going to grant 50,000 acres to land to one John Sutter, who himself was a German and Swiss immigrant in the Sacramento Valley. And the Sutter's Fort is going to become one of the big stopping points for a lot of Americans in the California territory. So technically, at this time, America does not control California, but we have more and more settlers who are moving out there, and we've even built a fort there that's going to be kind of a big resting point or stopping point for them. So we're slowly moving into California, and Mexico is naturally going to be their influence is going to start to dwindle in that part of the country or the area, because now that America's moving more in, Mexican control or influence is going to start to slip a little bit. Okay. Now, the white population there was still small. Only about 700 Americans are going to be living in California by 1845, but we're going to see that number is going to start to change relatively quickly. And to move gears a little bit and to end this, the Santa Fe Trail, that's going to be another big trail that opens in 1821 by William Becknell, an American trader. And the Santa Fe Trail is going to be very important in terms of connecting Santa Fe and New Mexico with Independence, Missouri. So this is going to start to be a trail where more and more Americans take to settle New Mexico. Okay. So caravan wagons are bringing U.S. goods to New Mexico and exchanging it for silver, mules, furs. And so trade is going to increase in this area. Although it's a relatively small American population that's living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, more and more are going out there, and it's going to become a more important trade asset. Farther east, Texas is going to start being a situation that America needs to pay attention to, but as more and more settlers are also moving to the Texas territories. And Texas kind of presented an interesting problem for America, because for a long time, this whole territory of Texas was basically kind of an unofficial buffer between the U.S., kind of over here to the more northeast area, and kind of Mexico, a little bit more to the southwest. And so it was kind of fishy who really owned parts of Texas, right? Because it seems like America owns some of these more northern eastern regions. Meanwhile, Mexico is controlling these kind of more southwestern regions. And so we weren't really fighting over it. We were just kind of sitting in the middle of it. But in the middle of all that, even you have these Native American tribes who don't really like either side being there, Comanches and Apaches, and they're going to start attacking both Americans and even Mexicans as well. And while Spain had controlled a lot of this region, they had even allowed some foreigners, including Americans, to settle in Texas just before Mexico declared independence, which they had, continued to do for years. And so as more Americans are coming in, these two nations, now that Mexico has declared its independence, they don't necessarily want Americans coming in at the same rate that Spain had. So Spain had kind of let Americans come in, but once Spain had been kicked out and Mexico's controlling everything, they're not as happy about Americans coming in. So this really puts the U.S. and Mexico on a collision course that is going to eventually lead to a war. So all this, again, is tied to manifest destiny. This idea that as more Americans are moving west, we're getting more territories, we're getting more states. That's also going to start to present more problems. I haven't really talked about slavery today, but as these areas are going to start kind of writing their state constitutions and becoming officially a part of the U.S., slavery is going to naturally play a pretty big role in all of those debates. Okay, so this is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'll take care of them. And you take care.